While the Tiger and the Panther often steal the spotlight in historical discussions, it was the Panzerkampfwagen IV that served as the true backbone of the German Panzerwaffe from the first day of World War II to the very last. Conceived in the mid-1930s by Heinz Guderian, the Panzer IV was originally designed not as a primary tank killer, but as an infantry support vehicle. It was meant to work alongside the lighter Panzer III, using its larger hull and bigger gun to suppress enemy bunkers and anti-tank positions. Little did the engineers know that this robust and adaptable chassis would eventually become the only German tank to remain in continuous production throughout the entire conflict. The initial versions of the Panzer IV featured a short-barreled 75mm KWK-37 gun, often nicknamed the stump or cigar but due to its low velocity. This weapon was perfect for firing high-explosive shells at soft targets, but it struggled against enemy armor. However, the true genius of the Panzer IV lay in its potential for growth. Its hull was wider and its turret ring larger than the Panzer III, which allowed it to be up-armored and up-gunned repeatedly as the war intensified. It was a masterpiece of conservative but effective engineering, a reliable platform that could be modified to meet every new threat emerging on the horizon. Mechanically, the Panzer IV was far superior to its heavier successors in terms of reliability. It was powered by a 300 horsepower Maybach V12 engine that was perfectly suited to its initial 18-ton weight. Unlike the Panther or Tiger, which were chronically underpowered and mechanically fragile, the Panzer IV was a rugged machine that could endure thousands of miles of travel across the dusty plains of Poland or the rugged terrain of the Balkans. It was the tank that German mechanics loved most because it was accessible, logical, and rarely suffered from the catastrophic transmission failures that plagued the later wonder weapons. The early campaigns in Poland and France in 1939 and 1940 were the golden era of the Panzer IV's original role. In these fast-moving Blitzkrieg operations, the Panzer IV proved to be an essential part of the combined arms team. While the lighter tanks engaged enemy vehicles, the Panzer IV would roll up and obliterate strongpoints with its heavy explosive rounds. It was during these years that the tank earned its reputation for being a stable and dependable machine, a silent partner in the dramatic victories that shocked the world and established Germany as the dominant military power in Europe. However, the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 changed everything. Suddenly, the Panzer IV found itself outclassed by the new Soviet T-34 and KV-1 tanks. The short-barreled 75mm gun, once so effective against bunkers, was now like a toy against the sloped armor of the East. This was the first major crisis for the Panzer IV, and it led to a radical decision: the infantry support tank had to become a dedicated tank hunter. This transition marked a turning point in the tank's history, as engineers began the desperate work of mounting a long-barreled, high-velocity gun into a turret that was never originally designed to hold one. This adaptability is what saved the Panzer IV from obsolescence. By late 1941, the tank began to receive its famous long-barreled 75mm KWK-40 gun, which transformed it into a lethal predator. This upgrade allowed the Panzer IV to engage T-34s from safe distances, making it once again the most dangerous machine on the battlefield. It was a testament to the foresight of its original designers that the chassis could handle the extra weight and recoil of a much larger weapon. The Panzer IV had survived its first brush with extinction, proving that in a long war, flexibility and reliability are far more valuable than raw power alone. The arrival of the upgraded Panzer IV, specifically the OSF F2 and G models, turned the tide for German armored divisions on the Eastern Front. With its new long gun, the Panzer IV became a sniper of the Russian steppes. It could now punch through the armor of the T-34 at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters, long before the Soviet gunners could accurately return fire. For the veteran German crews, this was a lifeline. They finally had a machine that could fight on equal terms with the Soviet giants. Throughout 1942 and 1943, the Panzer IV was the primary tool used to blunt Soviet offensives, serving as a reliable shield for the retreating Wehrmacht. Despite its improved firepower, the Panzer IV began to suffer from the weight trap. Every upgrade, more armor, a bigger gun, additional fuel, pushed the tank further away from its original design specifications. By the time the OSF H model appeared, the tank had grown from 18 tons to over 25 tons. This extra weight put immense pressure on the suspension and the narrow tracks, which were never widened to compensate. In the deep mud of the Russian Rasputitsa, the Panzer IV began to struggle, often sinking into the earth while the wide-tracked T-34 simply glided past, highlighting the limitations of an aging chassis being pushed to its absolute limit. To protect against the increasing threat of Soviet anti-tank rifles and hollow-charged shells, the Germans began to fit the Panzer IV with Scherzen, the iconic armored side skirts. These thin steel plates gave the tank a massive, menacing appearance, making it look much larger and more powerful than it actually was. While the skirts were effective at pre-detonating shells before they hit the main hull, they also added more weight and made the tank incredibly difficult to maintain. Mud and debris would get trapped between the skirts and the wheels, requiring the crew to spend hours cleaning out the mess just to keep the machine moving. The Battle of Kursk in 1943 was perhaps the most significant test for the Panzer IV. While the new Panthers and Tigers were suffering from massive mechanical failures, it was the hundreds of Panzer IVs that did the majority of the heavy lifting. They were the ones that sustained the offensive and held the line during the brutal Soviet counterattacks. Even when outclassed by the sheer volume of Soviet production, the Panzer IV crews used their superior training and better optics to inflict massive casualties. It was a war of attrition where the Panzer IV proved that a good enough tank in large numbers is often more valuable than a few perfect tanks that are broken down in the rear. Life inside the Panzer IV was a masterclass in German ergonomics, but it was also a place of constant fear. The interior was more spacious and better laid out than the Soviet T-34, allowing the crew of 5 to work together with high efficiency. The commander had a high-quality cupola with a 360-degree view, which gave him a massive tactical advantage in spotting the enemy first. However, the armor was still vertical and lacked the sloped protection of the newer designs. Every crew member knew that even a medium-caliber shell could penetrate their hull if they were caught out of position, making every engagement a high-stakes game of spot and shoot first. By late 1943, the Panzer IV was starting to reach the absolute limit of its potential. The Germans tried to mount even larger guns and thicker armor, but the chassis simply couldn't handle any more weight without the suspension collapsing. It was at this point that the Panzer IV shifted from being a conqueror to a defender. It was no longer the spearhead of the Blitzkrieg, but a mobile anti-tank platform used to plug holes in a crumbling front. Despite its age, it remained the most trusted tool of the Panzerwaffe, a machine that refused to quit even as the world around it was consumed by fire and steel. When the Allies landed in Normandy in June 1944, they expected to face a few elite Tiger and Panther divisions, but instead, they were met by thousands of Panzer IVs. In the dense, claustrophobic countryside of the French Bocage, the Panzer IV was a lethal opponent. Its long 75mm gun could easily destroy any Allied Sherman from a distance, while its smaller size made it much easier to hide in the thick hedgerows compared to the massive Tigers. The Western Allies soon realized that the old Panzer IV was still a terrifying predator that could turn any peaceful road into a graveyard of burning Shermans in a matter of seconds. The American and British tankers had a strange relationship with the Panzer IV. They respected its gun and its accuracy, but they also recognized its vulnerabilities. The Panzer IV lacked the thick armor of the Panther, meaning that a Sherman with a 75mm gun could actually destroy it if they could get close enough. This led to a desperate and violent game of cat-and-mouse in the French villages. The Panzer IV would sit in a concealed garage or behind a stone wall, wait for the Allied column to pass, and then fire into their vulnerable sides before retreating into the shadows. It was a brutal, personal form of warfare where experience and nerves were more important than technical specs. Logistics in the West were a nightmare for Panzer IV units. While the tank was reliable, it still needed fuel and ammunition, both of which were being pulverized by Allied air power. The J-bow or fighter bombers became the primary enemy of the Panzer IV. A tank that could survive a shell from a Sherman had no chance against a 500-pound bomb or a rocket from a Typhoon. German crews began to spend their days hiding under trees and camouflage netting, only moving at night to avoid the eyes in the sky. The legendary mobility of the Panzer forces was dead, replaced by a desperate, stationary defense. During the Battle of the Bulge, the Panzer IV once again took its place in the front lines. In the freezing snow of the Ardennes, the tank's narrow tracks became a fatal flaw. While the Soviet T-34s had wide tracks for snow, the Panzer IV struggled to maintain traction on the icy mountain roads. Many tanks were lost simply because they slid off the road into ravines or got stuck in deep drifts that they couldn't power through. It was a tragic end for a machine that had once been the king of the Blitzkrieg, now struggling just to move forward in the face of a brutal winter and a superior enemy. The Panzer IV also served as the basis for a dizzying array of specialized vehicles. Because the chassis was so reliable and common, the Germans used it to build everything from the Jagd Panzer IV tank destroyer to the Wirbelwind anti-aircraft tank and the Brummbär heavy assault gun. This Panzer IV family allowed the German army to maintain a high degree of parts commonality, which was the only thing keeping their logistics from completely collapsing in 1944. The Panzer IV wasn't just a tank, it was a modular weapon system that adapted to every desperate need of a dying empire. By the time the war reached the borders of Germany in 1945, the Panzer IV was fighting for survival. Many units were manned by young, inexperienced boys who had only a few days of training. These Hitler Youth crews would take their Panzer IVs into battle against overwhelming Allied numbers, often with tragic results. The tank was now old, its armor was insufficient, and its fuel was gone. But even in these final, dark days, the Panzer IV remained a symbol of German resistance, a rugged, battle-scarred veteran that had fought in every corner of Europe and was now ready to die in the ruins of its own home. The final days of the Panzer IV were spent in the rubble of Berlin. In the desperate street fighting against the Red Army, the Panzer IV was used as a mobile pillbox, hidden in basements or behind piles of bricks to ambush Soviet columns. It was a far cry from the sweeping maneuvers of 1940, but the tank's 75mm gun could still knock out an IS-2 or a T-34 at close range. When the final surrender came in May 1945, thousands of Panzer IVs were left abandoned across the continent, from the fjords of Norway to the mountains of Austria, marking the end of the most significant armored career in history. However, the story of the Panzer IV didn't end in 1945. While the Tiger and Panther became museum pieces, the Panzer IV went back to work. In the post-war years, many surviving tanks were sold or given to nations in the Middle East. Countries like Syria and Egypt acquired hundreds of Panzer IVs from France, Czechoslovakia, and Spain. These former Nazi tanks were refurbished and put back into frontline service, serving in a completely different world and fighting for a completely different cause, far from the cold fields of Europe where they had been born. The most incredible chapter of the Panzer IV's post-war life took place during the Six-Day War in 1967. More than 20 years after the fall of Berlin, Syrian Panzer IVs were dug into the Golan Heights, facing off against modern Israeli Super Shermans and Centurions. It was a surreal moment in military history, World War II veterans fighting a modern jet-age war. The Panzer IVs proved they could still be lethal, but they were eventually overwhelmed by Israeli air power and superior tactics. It was the final combat roar of a machine that had been designed in the age of horses and biplanes, finally meeting its end in the age of missiles and computers. The technical influence of the Panzer IV can still be seen in modern tank design. It was one of the first tanks to successfully implement the concept of a universal chassis that could be easily modified for different roles. Its focus on crew ergonomics, superior optics, and a three-man turret became the blueprint for almost every successful tank that followed. The Panzer IV proved that you don't need a superweapon to win battles, you need a reliable, adaptable, and mass-producible platform that can evolve with the war. It was a lesson that the Allies learned well, and one that modern militaries still follow today. Today, the Panzer IV is a beloved icon for historians and modelers alike. Standing next to one in a museum, you don't feel the same alien terror as you do with a Tiger. The Panzer IV looks like a real machine, built by real people to do a job. It is covered in bolts, hatches, and tools, a true mechanical soldier. It represents the industrial reality of World War II, a war that was won not by legendary monsters, but by millions of tons of steel and the men who had the courage to drive them into the unknown. In the final analysis, the Panzer IV was the greatest German tank of the war, not because it was the strongest, but because it was the most useful. It was there at the beginning, it was there at the end, and it never asked for anything more than fuel and a skilled crew. It was the workhorse of the Wehrmacht, a machine that carried the weight of an entire empire on its narrow tracks for 6 long years. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the life of the Panzer IV. Don't forget to like and subscribe as we continue to explore the iron legends that changed the world. Peace out.